Okay, well, appreciate everyone's patience. Our apologies to members of the public who are attempting to do the live streaming. We will be live streaming normally as soon as possible. But for right now, as chair, I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'm going to ask for an adoption of the agenda from the committee members that are present. We have 4 of our 5 committee members present. Thank you, Councillor Silovitz. Okay, all in favor of adopting the agenda? Okay, that carries unanimously. The 4 members that are here. So do any of the members of the committee have a disclosure of pecuniary interest? I see none. Okay, we go to the adoption of the previous minutes. Can I get a mover for our previous minutes? Thank you, Councillor Davidson. Any discussion there? All in favor? Any opposed? That carries unanimously, Mr. Clerk, and we can move into our scheduled business. We just have one item, and it involves a presentation from Gigi Lee, our Director of Financial Services, and our Treasurer. It will be up to 30 minutes, and then we will be looking to receive comments, ask questions when she's finished. So go ahead, Ms. Lee.
You know, it's just it's not working. Actually, you know what? Email it.
No, I can share it. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Today, we will continue with the series of Capital Sustainability Steering Committee meetings where the overarching objective is to present relevant background information to the committee to help inform the development of financial strategies to manage the capital program and funding to ensure the city's long-term financial sustainability. Specifically, we will focus on capital budget considerations as we set to launch the budget process for 2025. Next slide, please. Aside from the January and March meetings to set the foundation, we have completed the Rec and Culture Plan, as well as the Parks Plan meetings back in April and May. The purpose of today's meeting is threefold: to provide an overview and high-level financial impacts from the 2024 Asset Management Plan, an update on the legislative changes impacting development funding, and to review the general guidelines for the 2025 capital budget in light of some of the continuing funding pressures, as well as competing priorities. Next slide, please. The presentation is a high-level representation of Agenda 6.1. I'll walk us through these topics on the following slides. Next slide, please. It is important for us to understand the capital planning process. It follows an iterative approach whereby the first year's capital budget is approved and the 9-year capital forecast is received by council. It provides both the immediate capital investment needs as well as identifying the longer-term outlook of future capital needs and proactively address financial pressures. Directions at the beginning of the process enable staff to implement a capital budget strategy to achieve long-term capital sustainability based on available funding. The capital forecast is adjusted to reflect changing needs, emerging priorities, and external circumstances such as the pace of development, market conditions, and a review of the longer-term plans. The box in the middle highlights the process flow from CSSC to inform the budget committee and then council. The capital planning process enables the city to prioritize capital projects, allocate resources efficiently, and make informed decisions that support a growing, changing, and developing community. Next slide, please. This is a familiar slide that staff have repeatedly presented to demonstrate the connection of the various components informing the CSSC and the deliverables, which will then translate into a financial sustainability strategy and framework for future budgets. Over the last meetings, we discussed the Recreation and Culture Plan and Parks Plan, which are growth-related master plans identifying new and growth assets. Today, we'll turn to the Asset Management Plan. The plan provides a suggested evidence-based asset investment strategy that supports reliable city services and maintaining infrastructure in a state of good repair. Identifying and knowing upcoming asset renewal needs ensures the plan can be developed to maintain them in a financially sustainable manner. Next slide, please. The Asset Management Plan proposes an asset renewal plan to maintain the city's assets that have an estimated replacement value of $11.4 billion. The plan focuses solely on existing state of good repair infrastructure needs, with the analysis spanning from 2024 to 2051, so all existing assets would be compared over the same planning forecast as the city's master plans and studies. Based on the analysis, the Asset Management Plan determined there is a $284 million infrastructure backlog. This represents the overdue, as well as the current year life cycle asset investment needs. The asset management strategy recommends a phased-in annual investment approach that maintains current condition based on levels of service by 2051. Starting with 2024, capital budget's initial state of good repair investment of $57 million, the plan shows an increase of $4.6 to $6.1 million annually to address that backlog. For context, based on today's rates, the annual increases are roughly 0.5 to 0.8% for water and wastewater supported assets, 8.6% to 13.7% for stormwater related assets. Last but not least, 2.6% to 3.4% for tax supported assets. As you can see, additional annual provisions are needed for stormwater ponds and tree replacements. Next slide, please. The graph shown on this slide is a more visual representation of the previous slide, essentially highlighting the $284 million backlog as of 2024, and the strategy recommended to phase in the annual investment to maintain current condition base service levels by 2051. What is important to note is that the strategy focuses on existing state of good repair infrastructure, like-for-like needs, and does not include increases to the asset inventory levels from gross assets acquired or constructed to accommodate development. The phased-in approach will maintain current condition-based levels of service while considering financial sustainability. Next slide, please. As mentioned by Director Levesque last week, the EAM, or Enterprise Asset Management System, has the capability to forecast the impacts on assets levels of service under differing investment levels. Excuse me. And he showed the current pavement quality of the city's roads are at 76 out of 100, which means they are on average in good condition. The purple line that you see on this chart represents the pavement quality index if we use the 2024 state of good repair expenditure with a 2% annual increase for inflation. We can see that the PQI continues to drop as the road system ages. However, the estimated expenditure required to maintain the road condition to the city's set level of service is represented by the blue line. I wanted to reiterate this slide today to emphasize the need to fund asset investments over time, as proposed by the asset management strategy to gradually bridge the gap. You might have seen the news a few weeks ago that the City of Toronto is way behind on their capital spending for existing infrastructure. The city has budgeted $14 billion over the next 10 years to either maintain or replace their assets, but the actual amount needed to maintain the current service levels is about $40 billion. So the city is short $26 billion over the next decade. Many municipalities have deferred the rehabilitation of infrastructure in favor of short-term budget relief. The city has also experienced its own pressures here with stormwater management assets. The deferral of state of good repair, investments, the funding gap, and the impact of the catch-up that will be required. The upkeep of infrastructure is essential as it directly impacts our residents' quality of life. Next slide, please. Turning our minds to legislative updates related to developer funding. On April 10th of 2024 this year, the province introduced Bill 185. This legislation proposes to amend 15 other acts, including the Development Charges Act, the Municipal Act, and the Planning Act. In particular, Bill 185 proposes modifications to a number of the recent legislative changes introduced through Bill 109, Bill 23, as well as Bill 97. Bill 185 contains provisions to repeal the mandatory phase-in of DCs, resulting in the reversal of the required 5-year phase-in of DCs. Development charges bylaws enacted after January 1st of 2022 were required to phase in the calculated rates under Bill 23 over 5 years. The phase-in of DCs would have resulted in insufficient DC revenues for the city to support growth-related capital projects. Bill 185, if enacted, will allow the city to collect 100% of the council-approved rates in 2024. The removal of the 5-year phase-in would actually reduce the estimated revenue loss from Bill 23, and it's estimated to be around $29 to $30 million. It'll also better enable the city to support the cost of growth with less reliance on municipal property taxes to fund the shortfalls. Secondly, Bill 185 also amend the definition of eligible capital costs to allow for the inclusion of studies in the DC calculations once again. This will represent, again, a reversal of the previous legislative decision through the enactment of Bill 23, which removed the studies. This proposed amendment will allow municipalities to fund studies consistent with the bylaws passed prior to Bill 23, so that we're able to fund for master plans, DC background studies, and other studies as well. The reinstatement of studies as an eligible capital cost will reduce the estimated revenue loss from Bill 23 by approximately $7 million. Again, it would avoid the transfer of that financial burden of funding to property tax and ratepayers. Last but not least, Bill 108, which received royal assent on June 6 of 2019, resulted in several changes, which also included the development charges freeze period for 2 years. So essentially, the DC rate for developments was frozen, and it was at the time of the site plan and zoning bylaw amendment was submitted. Once the application is approved by the municipality, the DC rate would be locked in for a period of 2 years. What Bill 185 proposes is that freeze period, DC freeze period, would reduce from 2 years to 18 months with the intent to expedite building processes and incentivize developers to obtain building permits faster following the approval of their site plan or zoning bylaw amendment application. Next slide, please. Council adopted the DC bylaws on March 27th of this year. As mentioned on the previous slide, the city will have to amend the DC bylaws to reflect the inclusion of the studies and the removal of the phase-in of DCs, and that will have to be completed within 6 months of the bill being enacted. Staff will initiate the bylaw amendment process once Bill 185 is enacted by the province. I do want to point out that Bill 185 was on the legislative agenda yesterday, and the government was to dedicate most of the day to a third reading. The debate was close and it's not on the agenda today, so we can likely expect the bill to pass and receive royal assent shortly. Next slide, please. Also related to the legislative updates and changes, under Bill 23, the province made changes to the development charges and planning acts that would exempt affordable housing units from development-related charges. The bill was passed last September with the income and market rent threshold numbers that were released in the recent weeks. The legislation went into effect on June 1st. What you're seeing on this slide essentially is the Affordable Housing Bulletin that sets out the market-based and income-based thresholds that are to be used to determine the eligibility of a residential unit for an exemption from DCs. Municipalities will now have to exempt new housing units from development-related charges if the unit's purchase price or rent fall under these thresholds. Applicable units will be subject to agreements that provide for them to remain affordable residential units for 25 years, and units will also have to be sold or rented on an arm's length basis. The city is working with other municipalities, including the region, to understand the exemption and also to discuss the complexity and determine the administration of these agreements. Next slide, please. Closing in on the last topic of today, the city's capital budget and forecast is a continuous annual process. This slide highlights the considerations for 2025 and what can be expected at the upcoming BCW meeting in terms of budget strategy. The city implemented a pay-as-you-go strategy for tax-supported capital and has become unattainable as the city learns more about its assets and future replacement needs through the asset management plan and the enterprise asset management system, combined with inflationary pressures resulting in the widening of the funding gap. In order to close the gap, spending must be reduced by prioritizing the capital program, and the revenues must increase. We have made progress in providing background on some of the master plans, and comments received from the committee will be referred to staff for consideration in the upcoming budget process. Staff will continue to inform and consult with the CSSC on the other master plans and on the development of an updated financial sustainability strategy to ensure the city's long-term financial sustainability. Much work still needs to be done over the next year or two. In the interim, the 2025 capital budget strategy will follow a similar approach to provide a funding envelope for the major funding sources. Next slide, please. 3 scenarios are shown for tax-supported funding. As the name suggests, the tax-supported capital program is primarily funded by tax through tax-supported reserve funds and the revenues that are coming in from the operating budget through R&R transfer and the capital asset sustainability levy. Scenario 1 shown on the slide highlights the expenditures that are identified for the 10-year period in the 2024 capital forecast. You see that in 2024, the expenditures were capped at $32 million, and the projects were prioritized through the risk framework to direct investments to where they're needed the most. It means that projects were deferred to the later years in the forecast. You also notice that in the remaining years of the forecast, the anticipated spend is significantly higher. Overall, what this graph is showing is that at the current annual contribution level, which includes the annual CAS levy at the 1.5% equivalent, funding is insufficient to provide for the tax-supported capital program, and the reserve funds will be depleted in 2026. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not the first time we're seeing this trend for tax-supported capital. Staff started reporting the financial pressures back in 2014 and 2015, with the tax-supported reserve funds running out in 2021. And obviously the introduction of the last round of the CSSC. It is through continuous monitoring and implementing some of the measures I've indicated about prioritizing projects and increasing funding that we have prolonged the life of these reserve funds, and will need to continue to do the same. Next slide, please. Scenario 2 shown on the slide highlights the expenditures that are identified in the proposed asset management strategy, which is the 2024 approved level of funding adjusted for an annual inflation of 2% and on the average $4.2 million of phase-in. It also includes a provision for growth-related projects and studies. The difference between this and the earlier graph is that the forecast is more smoothed out, so you don't see the fluctuations and the ups and downs. It's a more gradual ramp up of the annual expenditures. It is showing that at the current annual contribution level, which again includes the 1.5% levy, the takeaway from this slide is that it is still unaffordable based on existing funding levels. Although the reserve funds are extended into 2027, it will be depleted. Next slide, please. The third scenario shown on the slide highlights the expenditures that are indexed from the previous year's approved capital budget for the tax-supported capital program with the factor for inflation. Again, it is showing that at the annual contribution level, which includes the 1.5%, we will start drawing and depleting the reserves, albeit at a much slower pace. The reserve funds are further extended to the end of the forecast. However, as you can see on the graph, it is trending down and delaying the inevitable. It'll just be outside of the forecast period that will also experience a reserve fund deficit. Next slide, please. A summary of the last 3 slides and the scenarios shown that scenarios 1 and 2 are unsustainable at the current funding levels. Although scenario 3 extends the life of the reserve fund, it's not sufficient to provide for the asset renewal needs and to maintain current levels of service, as there will be a growing backlog. Not investing in our assets can only be a short-term solution. For the 2025 asset management plan, consideration of proposed future levels of service will be brought forward for consideration. Council's desire to address the infrastructure backlog sooner or later, increasing or decreasing the level of service of very good, or increasing or decreasing funding will help guide the required investments to achieve the future desired performance of assets. For this and future CSSC discussions, key considerations will include balancing the infrastructure backlog, evolving asset conditions over time, identifying the appropriate service levels, managing cost pressures, factoring available sources of funding and financing, and also minimizing risk and furthering the desired vision for Richmond Hill. Next slide, please. At the May 29th Committee of the Whole meeting, staff presented the 2025 to 2032 Water and Wastewater Financial Plan in order to meet the statutory requirements of the Safe Water Drinking Act. The financial plan is not a budgetary commitment on the part of the city on future water and wastewater operations. However, it does highlight the future revenues, expenditures for capital, operating, as well as reserve funds and projected volumes outlining the future rates and the funding that's necessary for full cost recovery. The financial plan is a living document and is useful information that can be used here at the committee and also during the annual budget review process. As noted on the earlier slide, the phase-in AMP or asset management plan recommends annual increase averaging $4.6 to $6.1 million, which does comprise of $0.6 million to $0.8 million for water wastewater assets, which is one of the components contributing to the capital needs in the financial plan. The 2025 rate funding will follow the principles of the financial plan and evaluated during the budget process. Next slide, please. The Stormwater Management Financial Plan was initiated along with the Water and Wastewater Financial Plan. Early results present financial challenges as expected. Additional analysis is currently underway to validate the needs as well as to mitigate risk to the municipality. The Stormwater Management Financial Plan will be finalized and presented to committee in the fall in conjunction with the 2025 budget process. In the interim, it'd be prudent to follow a pay-as-you-go strategy prioritizing the 2025 capital based on the existing capital contribution levels. Next slide, please. As noted on the earlier slide, Bill 185 brings about positive changes from the perspective of the overall financial impact from Bill 23. At the same time, not just the city, but other municipalities are experiencing a decline in the industry and lower growth than forecasted due to market conditions. Staff are cautiously optimistic as the market is projecting the first interest rate reduction either tomorrow or July, that conditions will potentially improve and development will pick up for the latter half of this year. As always, staff will continue to monitor the development charges collections and the pace of development, reviewing the timing of capital projects and reserve funds as part of the annual capital budget process to ensure long-term financial sustainability. As a result, a similar funding envelope approach for 2025 will reflect the anticipated residual impact of Bill 23 and the projected growth forecast. Next slide, please. A little different than the development charges story, the city did anticipate lower collections of cash flow of Parkland as a result of Bill 23. However, the collection was for 2023 was actually quite a bit lower than expected. As alluded on the previous slide, not just the city, but other municipalities are also experiencing similar trends. As part of the 2025 process, Again, staff will continue to monitor the cash in lieu of parkland collections trend and pace of development. A similar funding approach for 2025 will reflect the anticipated impact of Bill 23, that is, and the projected growth forecast. Next slide, please. For next steps, the recommendation for agenda 6.1 is that the 2025 capital budget strategy considerations report be received and all comments be referred back to staff. Following today's meeting, the 2025 capital and operating budget strategy will be presented to June 11th Budget Committee of the Whole. Once Bill 185 is enacted, staff will initiate the DC bylaw amendments. That concludes my presentation today, Mr. Chair. I'll turn the meeting back to you. I do want to point out that Director Levesque, as well as his team, they're also here as well if there are any questions that are specific to the asset management plan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Madam Treasurer. Well, I'm gonna open up the questions. I don't think we all need to go back and forth. We apologize again to the public and who are maybe having difficulty hearing us. But I think we're just gonna carry on with the meeting. Thanks for the presentation. Now I'm gonna open it up. I'm looking for a motion to receive the presentation and for any questions or comments. Starting off with Councilor Davis.
Which to the benefit of the public, take a motion that's on the floor.
Okay.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of the public listening in, and I do once again apologize for our technical difficulties. The chair has recognized Councillor Davidson has made a motion, the recommendation of staff to receive the presentation and refer all comments back to staff.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. Can I hear just very simply, if we do kick the can down the road and we don't deal with stuff and we start to defer stuff, it keeps the reserve fund there a little longer. But what is the extra cost of doing that? I mean, is it significant? Is it catastrophic? Is it not that big a deal? I mean, considering most of our stuff's in pretty good shape, is it a big deal to say we're going to defer some of these big projects, or are we really asking for help? Mr. Chair, to whoever answer that one.
Yes, through the chair to Councillor Davidson. So the question is about the cost or the impact of deferring some of these projects. So first off, I would answer the question by saying that deferrals would make these projects more expensive. Right, obviously, with some of the trends that we saw over the last couple of years with inflationary factors. So definitely the financially, monetarily, the cost of deferrals is that it will be more expensive. And also the question about, what is the impact of kicking it down the road? At some point, we'll have to pay for this. And I think this is quite relevant to this. The question is that some of the conversations or discussions we've had about the stormwater management and some of the infrastructure, right? So that is a prime example at the city of deferring the inevitable. So what we have done with stormwater management and the related asset essentially is we have been deferring these projects and prioritizing them at the expense of the reserve fund. Hence, we're depleting the reserve fund and we're coming up to the point where now the reserve funds are depleted and there are projects that still need to be done. So then, when we look at coming back with the proposed rates, we talked about it last year when we're looking at a stormwater rate structure review. These increases to the rates will potentially be quite substantial. And it is the impact of deferrals.
Mr. Chair, so I feel like I haven't seen this. When staff come back in council to show us the options, is it possible to somehow, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but to say, we do this major infrastructure repair in 2026, it's going to, or 2025, it's going to be $3 million. And if we wait till 2029, it's going to be $6 million. Is there any way to actually give us a true perspective of what the increased cost is? I understand stuff's going to cost more in 3 years than it does now, but on a bigger scale, I honestly have no feel for how much that is and whether that's even something we can pay for as with the money we'll be bringing in. You know what I mean?
Through the chair to Councillor Davidson. So the question is about what the actual cost potentially may be of deferring some of these projects, in addition to inflation per se. So I'm actually going to defer that to Manager Titus to give you a response.
Oh, it doesn't work here. It works. Okay. Sorry, it works through the microphone. Through the chair to the councillor. In terms of costs of deferrals of projects, in terms of globally of all projects, it's a little bit difficult to say, but I can give an example, a real concrete example. When we look at roads, which is what Director Lee had shown on her slide, in terms of the pavement quality decreasing over time. So what happens is as the road deteriorates, it identifies resurfacing for that road. If there's not enough funding to do resurfacing for that road, then it doesn't get resurfaced. And then the reconstruction of that road, which is a lot more expensive, comes up sooner. So in terms of dollars, roughly it's around $65 per square meter to resurface a road, excuse me, versus $300 per meter to reconstruct that road. So it's about making sure there's enough funding to do a more cost-effective solution sooner, as opposed to if that asset continues to deteriorate due to a lack of funding, the downstream treatment is a lot more costly. So that was just a quick example in terms of $65 cost per meter versus $300 for a full reconstruction of a road.
That's exactly the stuff I feel that I need to be able to understand to make decisions like this. So thank you. Is the cash in lieu short because we're not building much or as much anticipated? Why is there shortfall for parks and cash in lieu? Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, to Councillor Davidson. So just to repeat the question is why the cash in lieu of parkland collections is significantly lower than what's been projected. Staff are currently still analyzing that, but I think the one part that we need to understand is that for cash in lieu of parkland, developers have the option of dedicating land or giving the municipality cash. So in this situation, as I said, we're still analyzing, but perhaps in 2023 that we did receive dedication of land as opposed to cash. The other part of it also is, as I mentioned earlier, I think overall there is a trend that we're seeing with slower growth overall, not just in Richmond Hill, but across the industry as well, because some of the market conditions. So definitely that is the trend that we're seeing across the GTA, and hoping that with some of the upcoming Bank of Canada interest rate announcement that it will help with some of the changes.
Two more questions through you, Mr. Chair. So we have some new residents hopefully in the next few years with some of this development. Where do new taxpayers play in it? I always think, oh, well, we're building, there must be more money in the coffers, but can you give me a perspective on new residents start putting into the pot of tax money growing? Does that make it much different? So do they also need as much? So it's an even game. Can you explain what new taxpayers mean to the coffers, please?
Through the chair, just repeating Councillor Davis, your question. Your question is about when and where the new residents and new development and the taxes come in terms of from a budgeting perspective. So the short answer is that, that the city is, that the mandate of the city is to deliver the same levels of service to new growth as well. So what you see in terms of the taxation revenue is that it comes through the operating budget. So when we go through the budget process, you'd be very familiar with the concept of assessment growth. So that is the projection of new development that's coming in. That is a projection of new tax dollars that are coming into the operating budget to offset the costs that are related to new development. So in addition to that, there's also the capital asset sustainability levy. So once the development or the property is in place, they will also start contributing to that levy as well. So they will be a part of the funding equation, providing revenues into the reserve funds for the repair and replacement of assets, existing assets, and the assets that are coming in.
And last question, Mr. Chair, is the DC charges for more affordable housing, has there been much pickup on that? Is it an enticing thing so far for you? Are we seeing any uptake?
Through the chair to Councillor Davidson, I'm just going to repeat your question first. So the question is whether the city is seeing any uptake in terms of affordable housing units. The short answer is not a lot. So
To clarify for you, Mr. Chair, so even though these are pretty big hits for the municipality in terms of giving breaks, it's not even enough to get shovels in the ground for more affordable.
through the chair, again, just to repeat Councillor Davidson's question. So it is about the actual impact of some of the exemptions that are mandated by the province. Perhaps we can go back to one of the earlier slides. It's slide 11, that's correct. So slide 11 highlights the dollar thresholds that the province has released from the Affordable Housing Bulletin, which provides those dollar thresholds that will be used to determine eligibility of a residential unit for exemption. And it started on June 1st. So it's essentially what you can see here is what is considered affordable when it comes to purchase price within Richmond Hill. It's $452,000. What it means is that for any housing, if the purchase price comes below that threshold at 452, is when the developer or development will get an exemption on DCs. That number is quite low. And I do want to emphasize and add that it's not just for Richmond Hill, because the Affordable Housing Bulletin was released for not just Richmond Hill, but for municipalities across Ontario. And generally speaking, I would say that the numbers are on the lower end. So that's why, when the question is asked about, are there a lot coming in terms of affordable housing units, not a lot would make this threshold.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Davidson, for those questions. Did anyone else have any questions? Regional Councilor Chan.
I will just raise my voice. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Treasurer Lee, for the presentation. Quite a number of information to digest. And I appreciate that probably this question is slide 11. I have some question too, but probably has been answered. I'm sure more to come. I'd like to focus on slide number 19 and 20. Through Mr. Chair. Bill 2030, that was actually not that long ago, have resulted in a number of municipalities, as most municipalities in Ontario, including we're all busy saying that X million of dollars would be impacted in terms of software. The first bullet is say will decrease. I gather perhaps I for one be interested by how much, either in terms of magnitude, percentage wise, or maybe the same thing is in dollars term. I know it's all estimate, but now things seem to be clear, particularly now with the input from mentioned about legislative bulletin, give further indication about at what threshold with those exemption will be there to charge. So my question is simply, I expect it's not today because the numbers are here. At what point in time that might be 3 million members of the council that wants the public would expect to see now by July first or September first, now this is our revised estimate in terms of the impact of Bill 23 as amended due to Bill 25 this year. So if you have the estimated guess magnitude wise, yes. If not, when possibly we might get information. Thanks, Chair.
Through the chair, to Deputy Mayor Chan. So I'm just going to first off repeat the question, which is what is the updated or revised impact of Bill 23 and what it means once the changes from Bill 185 is in place. So I do want to point out that during the presentation, I did allude to some of the numbers. So overall, when we presented the development charges update back in March, we provided council with an update of $190 million in terms of impact of Bill 23. So it was $190 million. Out of the $190 million, almost $30 million was related to the phase-in, the 5-year phase-in. So effectively with Bill 185, when it's enacted, we can expect to be able to remove that impact of roughly $29 to $30 million. I do want to say that it is an estimate because obviously our bylaws were adopted in March. So from March to now, we have already been only collecting at the 80%. However, because it was intended to be a 5-year phase-in, as soon as we're able to do the bylaw amendment, we will be able to start at 100%. So it is going to be, the impact it's small compared to the 29. So that's the $29 million out of the 190. So that's roughly 15%. And the other comment I made with respect to the studies was that during the DC process, we did update that the capital cost of studies was about $7 million. So once again, once we do the bylaw update, we'll be able to now include those costs in the DC studies once we amend it. So again, that's also going to reduce the overall loss of $190 million by the approximately 7.
Thank you very much. And I think that all members of public office, including us council, would like to hear now that we have better sense to what extent those estimated impact back or about back are really falling out with all these successive legislative changes from our brother and sister in Scott. So turning to slide number 20, which I mentioned, contrary to what I just asked, the presentation as shown in here, we have a better handle of the numbers. As it's indicated, less than 3 million being collected. So I'm just thinking about, I noticed that highlighting in bold going forward that that certainly will be an impact. We go about less money collected for the public purposes. So with that, fair to say that we might come back as shown early on with the budget committee on in June or later on, show what would be the impact specifically in 2024 and in years to come, or probably 2025 and years to come.
Through the chair, to Regional Councillor Chen. So the question is about what the anticipated impact will be on cash flow of Parkland for 2024 and future years. So as I mentioned earlier, we are doing a deeper analysis. Obviously, we're seeing a slightly different trend between development charges and cash flow of Parkland. So we will be doing that as part of our analysis over the summer months and also be bringing forward as part of the 2025 budget. What I will say is that what you can expect for the 2025 budget strategy is that we want to be more conservative in terms of establishing a funding envelope because we don't want to overuse the cash flow of Parkland reserve funds. So what you see as part of the strategy is that for now, we are recommending that we have a guideline that we're going to set at about $6 million so that we are more conservative with respect to what we're anticipating to bring in, seeing the trend or seeing the results from 2023. But as I mentioned earlier, we are doing the analysis and we'll be reporting that back as part of the budget process.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely more updates, it's not close by and, that's. Certainly the picture becomes clearer. Thank you very much for your answer and thank you, Mr. Chair. Awesome.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Chan. I don't see anyone else who's indicated a desire to speak or ask questions. I support the motion on the floor to receive the comments. We're going to be updated further as we go along. And I believe our staff's going to come forward with some recommendations. You know, it's simply the case, it's the fact that if we do everything, we continue as we are, we don't have enough money to fund our group. We don't have enough in those reserves to do so. But that's based on fully adopting the ideal with our transportation master plan and our parks plan. And you know, that's under the scenario that we you know, continue business as normal and you know, we have all the capital infrastructure projects on our wish list to accommodate. We don't have enough money to accommodate them all. But this committee, and this is the place, this sustainability committee, where we might have to make some decisions about some changes, about doing things a little bit differently, and lessening that burden on our reserves to our capital infrastructure projects. So do we scale back some projects, do we eliminate some projects, can we do that and still safely deliver services to our residents? So that's really going to be, we really appreciate this update. All the work that goes into this, the change in the legislative framework. We know it will continue to change, it will continue to be updated, and we'll continue to be in a better and better position to make those decisions when the time comes. But this is all part of our 2025 budget process. I don't mind the fact that we're capping our capital spending. So right now we're getting our budget process with a strategy to cap our capital spending to not spend 1/10% of your capital plan, to limit it at 33 million. That recommended level, I think it's a good level until this committee does its work and we assess what our genuine needs are, or maybe a revamp some of your capital plan. So thank you very much for coming forward with that. I'm just going to call the question on the motion on the floor. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, again, that carries unanimously. Once again, my apologies to our members of the public who were unable to hear this meeting. I think we're going to make efforts to keep you informed of what transpired here, and we'll get our live stream going and for our meeting tomorrow morning. So I need a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Councilor Sullivan. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, that carries unanimously. Thank you very much, committee. Thank you, finance staff.